The first sign came while my son was laughing. Nathan sat beside Alina at the dinner table, his hand resting lightly over hers as they talked about the wedding. Across from them, her parents smiled politely. Richard and Marianne Vale looked like the kind of couple who had spent their entire lives in expensive restaurants and quiet boardrooms. Perfect clothes, perfect manners, perfect smiles. Then Marianne turned toward her husband and lifted her hands. I recognized the first sign immediately. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I said nothing. Richard answered her in sign language. They assumed I couldn't understand. They were wrong. For years, I had quietly understood sign language because of my late wife, Evelyn, and her deaf sister. It had become part of our family long before Nathan ever met Elena. But nobody at that table knew that. I watched Richard's hands. At first, it was ordinary enough. Then I saw Nathan's name. Then loan. Then security. My stomach tightened. Marianne glanced toward Nathan and Alina before signing again. I caught only fragments. He won't know. Until the papers. I lowered my eyes and took another bite. My heart was beating faster now, but I forced myself to chew. Then Richard signed something slowly enough that I understood every word. Once the marriage is official, his assets become much easier to reach. My hand froze around my glass. For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood him. I looked at Nathan. He was smiling at Alina. She squeezed his hand. He had absolutely no idea what was being discussed 10 feet away. Then Alina noticed me staring. Everything okay, Mr. Whitmore? Which Whitmore? I looked at the woman I had already begun thinking of as the daughter I never had. I smiled. Couldn't be better. She smiled back. Richard and Marianne continued their silent conversation. I kept eating. But something inside me had changed. This wasn't about an awkward family dinner anymore. Someone was discussing my son's future as though it were a piece of property they could simply reach for. Before we continue, subscribe and join our growing family for emotional stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable life lessons. Also, tell me your country in the comments. I love reading where everyone's watching from. That night, I didn't tell my son what I'd seen. Because before I accused the woman he loved, I needed to know exactly what her family was planning. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, you need to understand one thing about Nathan. He wasn't just my son. He was my best friend. After Evelyn died, it was Nathan who kept me from disappearing into that empty house. We had our Saturday breakfasts, 2 eggs, toast, and far too much coffee. When my old motorcycle refused to start, Nathan spent an entire Sunday beside me in the garage, grease on his hands and a grin on his face. Whenever life gave him a decision, I was usually the first person he called. When he graduated, I stood in the crowd holding back tears. Then Alina came into his life. At first, I liked her immediately. She remembered how I took my coffee. She brought old photographs she'd found of Nathan and Evelyn. She asked questions about my late wife instead of avoiding her name. And before the wedding was even announced, she called me Dad. I won't pretend that didn't touch something deep inside me. For the first time since Evelyn died, I thought maybe life was giving me the daughter I'd never had. That's why what happened at that dinner hurt so much. My understanding of sign language went back to Evelyn's younger sister, Claire, who had been deaf. I learned it because I never wanted her sitting at a family gathering feeling like everyone was speaking around her. I hadn't used it much in recent years. Until that dinner. I only knew that, for the first time, I was looking at Alina's family a little differently. And before that night was over, I would discover that the people sitting across from me had already been looking at Nathan very differently too. The Vale family knew how to make people feel important. Richard's house stood behind iron gates on a quiet street where every lawn looked perfectly trimmed. There were 2 luxury cars in the driveway, and the dining room had hosted charity dinners attended by people whose names appeared in newspapers. Richard seemed to know everyone. Business owners, city officials, people who shook his hand and remembered his name. Nathan admired him. I understood why. Richard could enter a room full of strangers and leave with half of them believing they had known him for years. At a charity dinner, I watched him thank a waiter by name, compliment a local councilman, and spend 20 minutes discussing business with a man who owned 3 companies. He was polished, generous, respectable. Exactly the sort of father any future son-in-law would be proud to have. That made the small things harder to explain. One evening, Richard asked Nathan, almost casually, "Have you thought about your long-term assets?" Nathan laughed. "That's a strange question for dinner." Richard smiled. "I'm thinking about your future." Not once did he ask Nathan whether he was happy. Another afternoon, Marianne asked me, "Arthur, what does Nathan actually own?" I looked at her. "Why?" She smiled. "I'm simply trying to understand the family." I gave her a vague answer. Elena began talking more often about their future. After we're married, we could build something bigger. Sometimes she mentioned investments. Sometimes she talked about helping her father's company expand. Always, she made it sound romantic. Wouldn't it be wonderful if both our families grew together? I wanted to believe her. Then one evening Nathan sat beside me on my porch. "Dad," he said, "I finally feel like I found my family." I smiled at him. I wanted to say, "You already had one." Instead, I put my hand on his shoulder. "I'm happy for you, son." But inside, one question wouldn't leave me. Which family? The next thing I discovered wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a number. And that number was far larger than anything I'd expected. The first document I noticed was lying beneath Nathan's coffee cup. He picked it up quickly when he saw me looking. "Wedding paperwork?" I nodded. "Nothing exciting." He folded it and slipped it into his briefcase. I didn't ask again. If I had learned anything from 73 years of life, it was that people tell you more when they don't feel interrogated. 2 days later, I saw Richard outside his office with an accountant. They weren't talking like two businessmen discussing growth. I was passing in my car when I noticed Richard's expression. I couldn't hear everything through the glass, but several words carried when the door opened. Emergency financing. Collateral. Deadline. Then I heard Nathan's name. I kept driving. That evening, I called an old colleague from my banking days. I didn't ask him to do anything improper. I simply asked what he could find through legitimate public records. The answer came 3 days later. Richard's company wasn't thriving. It was drowning. There were substantial debts, missed obligations, declining assets, and a major loan approaching maturity. But one detail bothered me more than the debt. Nathan's name appeared repeatedly in documents connected to proposed financing. I sat alone at my kitchen table, reading the information twice. Why would my son be connected to a company he didn't own? The next morning, I asked him casually, "Has Richard ever asked you to guarantee anything?" Nathan looked genuinely confused. "No, why?" I stirred my coffee. "Just curious." He smiled. "You worry too much, Dad." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was seeing danger where there was only complicated business. Maybe Richard really was preparing Nathan for a bigger future. But then I remembered the dinner. The signs. Nathan's name. The word security. I could have told Nathan everything I'd seen. I wanted to. But if I accused the woman he loved without proof, I might destroy his happiness myself. So I made a decision. I would say nothing. Not yet. I would find the truth first. I had finally found the hole in the veil's story. What I hadn't found yet was the person who planned to push my son into it. After that dinner, I started paying attention to Elena. Not because I wanted to dislike her. Quite the opposite. I wanted desperately to prove myself wrong. Around Nathan, she remained the same woman I'd welcomed into my family. She laughed at his jokes, remembered his appointments, and reached for his hand whenever they walked into a room. But when Nathan left, something changed. One afternoon, he stepped outside to take a phone call. Elena stayed in the kitchen with me. She stirred her coffee and asked, almost casually, "Arthur, have you thought about what happens to your retirement accounts after you're gone?" I looked at her. "That's a rather serious question." She smiled. "I'm only thinking about Nathan." A few days later, she asked about my house. Then my investments. Then whether Nathan would inherit everything. Finally, she asked if I'd updated my will. I answered none of them directly. One evening, she sat across from me and lowered her voice. "You're going to make sure Nathan is protected after you're gone, right?" "Right?" I smiled. "That's always been the plan." "Good." The word was gentle, But something about her expression wasn't. It wasn't relief. It was calculation. That night, I checked something I hadn't wanted to check. I discovered Alina had been communicating with Richard about Nathan's finances. The messages weren't romantic. They weren't casual. They were numbers, accounts, assets, questions about what Nathan could contribute. I read them twice. Then I closed the screen. There was still one possibility I couldn't dismiss. Maybe Alina was simply helping her father. Maybe she didn't understand how dangerous his situation was. Maybe Richard had manipulated his own daughter. I wanted that to be true, because the alternative meant the woman I had welcomed into my family had been studying my son's future like a balance sheet. That question kept me awake for 3 nights. Then I saw something Alina did when she thought Nathan wasn't watching. The next family gathering was at Richard's house. I arrived early, not because I was eager to see him, because I wanted a clear view of the dining room. Richard and Marianne were standing near the window when I walked in. They began signing. I recognized the first few phrases immediately. Loan. Deadline. Nathan. Assets. My pulse quickened. Then Richard signed something about a prepared agreement. Marianne looked toward the hallway. I followed her eyes. Elena had just entered. Richard stopped signing. That alone told me something. Elena looked directly at her father. Then, without saying a word, she raised her hands. She signed back. My stomach dropped. She understood. Not a little. Not accidentally. She understood everything. I watched them exchange several signs before Nathan walked into the room. The conversation ended instantly. Elena smiled at him. Ready for dinner? Nathan kissed her cheek. Always. I said nothing. Later that evening, I went looking for my coat. As I passed Richard's study, I heard voices through the partly closed door. I stopped. Elena was inside. Once Nathan signs, the bank won't care where the money came from. Richard's voice was low. And Arthur? There was a pause. Then Elena answered. He's old. Nathan will choose me over him. I stood completely still. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. The woman I'd imagined as the daughter I never had just reduced my son's future to a choice she expected him to make between his father and herself. I quietly stepped away before they could hear me. Outside, the night air felt cold against my face. I didn't go home angry. I went home disappointed. There is a difference. Anger makes you want to strike back. Disappointment makes you question every moment you thought you understood. I still didn't tell Nathan. Not yet. Instead, I opened an old contact list and found the number of a financial law colleague I trusted for decades. My finger hovered over the call button. Then I pressed it. I had spent weeks wondering whether Elena knew. That night, I finally had my answer. What I didn't know was how much worse the truth could get. My attorney, Samuel Grant, arrived the following morning with a forensic accountant named Lydia Shaw. I told him everything I'd seen. The sign language. Richard's questions. Elena's conversations. The strange documents. Samuel didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question. How much do you know for certain? Not enough, I said. Good. He opened his briefcase. Then we'll find out. For the next several days, Lydia examined Richard's company records, while Samuel traced the legal documents connected to the proposed financing. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Richard's company was close to insolvency. Several lenders were demanding repayment. Assets had been valued far above what they were actually worth, and the proposed restructuring depended heavily on Nathan's financial position. Then Lydia found something that made her stop turning pages. This isn't just a business investment, she said. She showed me a separate agreement. If Nathan joined Richard's company after the marriage, certain debts could eventually become his responsibility. Debts Nathan hadn't created. Debts he didn't even know existed. I stared at the pages. So the wedding is the deadline. Samuel nodded. More accurately, the marriage creates the opportunity. That evening, Nathan came to my house carrying a folder. He was smiling. Dad, look. Inside were photographs of the venue, flowers, invitations, and the seating plan. Everything is finally coming together. I looked at his face. He was happy. Completely happy. For one terrible second, I wanted to tear every document in front of me apart and tell him everything. Instead, I forced a smile. Nathan studied me. "You're happy for me, right?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "More than you know." He hugged me, and I stood there holding my son while knowing that the woman he planned to marry was helping position him beneath debts that could destroy his future. My son thought he was preparing for a marriage. His future in-laws were preparing something entirely different, and the wedding date was the deadline. Lydia called me just after 7 the next morning. Her voice was different. "We found the structure." I drove straight to Samuel's office. 3 folders were waiting on the conference table. The first contained Richard's loan applications. The second contained the proposed restructuring. The third contained communications between Richard and Elena. Samuel pointed to the numbers. "Richard needs a massive rescue loan. The lender wants additional security." He turned the page. Nathan. My stomach tightened. The plan was simple enough to understand. Nathan's assets would strengthen the application. His future inheritance would make the family appear financially safer. And once the marriage was official, the arrangement would become far easier to justify. Then Lydia showed me something worse. Richard's company had been presented as significantly healthier than it really was. Some projections had been deliberately inflated. Certain liabilities had been pushed out of view. "This isn't aggressive accounting," Lydia said quietly. "It's deception." I stared at the documents. Then Samuel slid the third folder toward me. "We found the communications." The first message was from Richard. The next was from Elena. I read it once. Then again. My hands went cold. She wasn't merely aware of her father's plan. She was helping him coordinate it. Then I reached one message that made everything suddenly clear. Elena had written, "Once Nathan understands how much this marriage protects his family, he'll stop asking questions." I leaned back in my chair. For weeks, I'd hoped there was some explanation. Perhaps Elena was being pressured. Perhaps she didn't understand. There was no misunderstanding anymore. They weren't trying to join our family. They were trying to use it as a financial lifeboat. Samuel watched me carefully. "What are you going to do?" I thought about Nathan. His smile when he showed me the wedding photographs. The way he'd said he finally felt he'd found his family. I could expose everything that afternoon. But if I walked into his house with accusations, Nathan might hear only one thing. His father was trying to destroy the woman he loved. So I chose the harder path. I would let the evidence speak. If you're still with me, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Because what happened next would force my son to choose between the future he believed he was building and the truth his father had uncovered. I finally knew what they wanted from my son. But I still had one problem. Nathan loved her. And I couldn't save him by making him believe his father was simply jealous. The same dining room looked different the second time. The same polished table. The same crystal glasses. But this time, I knew exactly what was sitting beneath all those smiles. Richard placed a folder beside Nathan's plate. "Just routine paperwork," he said. Elena smiled at Nathan. "Once this is done, everything becomes official." Nathan reached for the folder. I spoke before he could open it. "Before Nathan signs anything, does everyone agree that he should understand exactly what he's signing?" The room went silent. Richard looked at me. "Of course." "Good." I placed several documents on the table. His face changed. I watched him scan the first page. "Where did you get these?" I had questions. Richard tried to laugh. "Arthur, you're misunderstanding complicated business matters." "Then explain them." He couldn't. Every explanation created another contradiction. Nathan looked from his future father-in-law to me. "Dad, what's going on?" I looked at him. "Ask Richard why your name appears on these agreements." Richard started talking quickly. I let him. Then I reached into my pocket and placed my phone on the table. "I also have something else you should hear." I pressed play. Elena's voice filled the room. Nathan's face went completely still. Then I looked at Richard. "I understood every conversation you had in sign language." Marianne's hand flew to her mouth. Elena went pale. Nathan stared at her. "Is this true?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He asked again. "Did you plan to use my future to save your family's company?" Her eyes filled with tears. Nathan, it wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Richard stepped forward. This is between the adults. I stood. No. I looked at my son. This is your life. Your decision. Nathan slowly removed his engagement ring. He placed it in Alina's trembling hand. I was going to marry you. His voice broke. But I wasn't going to become your family's collateral. He walked away from the table. But breaking the engagement was only the beginning. Richard had already made one financial mistake that neither of them could undo. The consequences began before sunrise. Richard's lender received the evidence. Then another call followed. Then another. The rescue financing was suspended. Accounts connected to the disputed transactions were reviewed. Business partners who had once praised Richard's judgment suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Within days, the image he'd spent decades building began to crack. The company wasn't the thriving empire everyone believed it was. It had been surviving on borrowed time. And now that time had run out. I watched none of it with satisfaction. I had wanted my son safe. That was all. When Nathan came to my house, he looked exhausted. He sat across from me and stared at his untouched coffee. I don't know what hurts more, he said. Losing Elena or realizing I never knew her. I didn't answer immediately. There are moments when a father shouldn't fill silence just because he's uncomfortable with it. Finally, Nathan looked at me. Why didn't you just tell me? I knew that question was coming. Because if I'd told you before, I had proof, you might have defended her against me. He lowered his eyes. I might have. I know. I reached across the table. And I would rather have you discover the truth than spend the rest of your life wondering whether your father stole your happiness. Nathan swallowed hard. You knew she was dangerous. I suspected. You were scared. Terrified? He looked at me. Of losing me. I nodded. Not financially, as your father. His eyes filled. I continued. You don't need to watch them fall, Nathan. You just need to make sure you don't fall with them. He nodded slowly. For weeks, he'd been planning a wedding. Now he had to learn how to imagine his life without it. That was the part nobody saw in the headlines, the meetings, or the collapsing business. My son wasn't celebrating a victory. He was grieving a future he'd already begun to love. And I stayed beside him. No lectures. No, I told you so. Just as father. That afternoon, we returned to the house where the first dinner had taken place. The table was still there. The same chairs. The same room where Richard and Marianne had assumed an old retired man couldn't understand them. I looked at that table and realized something. They had underestimated me because they saw my age. They saw retirement. They saw an ordinary grandfather sitting quietly beside his son. They never saw the years of experience behind that silence. But even that wasn't my greatest strength. It wasn't my knowledge of sign language. It wasn't my financial experience. It wasn't the people I knew. It was knowing my son well enough to protect him without stealing his choices from him. Sometimes protecting the people we love doesn't mean fighting their battles for them. It means standing beside the truth until they're ready to see it themselves. The most dangerous betrayal isn't always taking someone's money. Sometimes it's pretending to love someone while secretly calculating what they can give you. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, turn on the bell, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell me honestly, did Arthur do the right thing by waiting for proof instead of immediately confronting his son? Until next time, remember, love should never require you to surrender your future